Welcome to Leaders Gotta Lead. Join our leaders and hosts, Dan Gomer and Scott Harshman, as they bring you powerful strategies and insights to help you lead with purpose, impact, and unstoppable success.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Leaders Gotta Lead podcast. Today we have Jen Gallegos. Real quick, I say Gallegos, but I hear you say how do we say it?
Yep, it's Gallegos, and it's a long story, and that has a lot of family history to it, but it's Gallegos.
Gallegos.
All right. That's crazy. I'm from Pueblo, so that's not how you say Gallegos in Pueblo, okay?
No. Yes, there are. It's so funny. Whenever I meet someone that has like a Gallegos last name, they're like so happy to like be connected. It's like the funniest thing ever. But
well, no matter how you say it,
Gallegos.
we appreciate you being on here. By the way, quick side note, I have been called Gomer before.
Oh, that's fancy.
That's French.
It was I felt very French.
Gomer.
Yeah.
My favorite is Gallegos. That's like my favorite is
That is
Gallegos.
a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody messes up Harshman.
It's not very hard. It's not very hard. I just get made fun of for being a harsh man. I don't get it, but whatever.
Wrong emphasis.
That's funny. I didn't even think of that.
All right. But I digress. So, Jen, thanks for being here today. Real quick, so I'm just going to kind of read through some of this because there's no way I could memorize everything that you've done. And, we're really excited to have you on this podcast because Leaders Gotta Lead is all about just having great leaders in any facet, right? So it could be real estate, but education, it could even just be parents or people who have a passion for good leadership. And we're just having discussions about what it means to be a good leader and how do we get better and that kind of stuff. And so that's what the show is all about. And so, Jen has an extensive background in lots of different facets in leadership. She started her career in education. She now works in the finance field. She's done leadership development for the schools. And so she started as a school teacher. Then she was a dean of students. Then she was an assistant principal, then a principal, then director of student discipline and truancy for Jeffco Schools, where she managed discipline and truancy for 160 schools and 85,000 students. And she was also the governor's appointee on the Colorado State Council for 5 years and has been working to creating and providing training and support for all the school districts. So she goes around and helps the school districts develop leadership programs and things like that. So now she's leading leaders and developing leaders. She also was a competitive dancer through college and coached that for 13 years at the high school level. Now she is focused. Now she runs, I wouldn't say focused, but also works with her husband in the financial world as a mortgage lender, recognized as one of the top 1% nationally in terms of production. And so I could go on and on. There's even more here, but I think the synopsis of that whole thing is you've had the opportunity to be in a lot of different leadership roles throughout your career. So I always like to start out this podcast by asking the same question. And that question is, what is a good leader to you? After all of that experience, everything we went through, what does it mean to be a good leader?
And first and foremost, we just need to give her some praise.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. And by the way, if I would have not known who you were, I would have thought you were like 65 with everything that you've done.
maybe I am.
Phone talk is really good these days.
I will say that I after overseeing discipline and attendance through COVID, those years I dye my hair more frequently than before that little stint. So just know that leadership role did take a little out of me. But here I am. I'm still standing, so that's good.
Well, you were braver than me. I mean, I only made it 7 years in education. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. You're still running back into the building,
Oh yeah, yes. But now I just get to tell them what I think they should do, and then I leave. Like I don't, so that's a little bit of a different role. Man, okay. Well, so what makes someone a great leader? So I want to talk a little bit about characteristics. But before I do that, I think there's a couple things that I think when we're thinking about leading, that there's like a few different like components of that. So like the first one is that you have to have the ability to like lead yourself. And we can dig into that in a little bit. But I think a lot of times when people think of being a leader, it's about like external, like what are those, how am I leading a team or whatever. But like, man, it starts with leading yourself. And like, if you can't lead yourself, like you're going to really struggle if you're leading other people. So the second one is leading other people. And then the third one is how are you leading in a way that like you can collaborate with others, right? Because likely if you are leading a group of people, there's like a team component to that. And so you have to be really mindful of what that looks like. So as we're thinking about characteristics, there's kind of like three big buckets of things that you're thinking of. When I think of, just at like a very general level of like what makes someone a great leader, people really want to know when they're looking at someone that's leading them, they want to know are you going to help me? Do you value me? And can I trust you? And I think that sometimes in leadership development we make it sometimes more difficult than it needs to be, but like people really want to know, like, do you see me, are you going to help me, and can I trust you? And there's lots of different ways to kind of like build on those, and the characteristics that you find in a leader that help with that. I think one of the things that I've seen the most with leaders that I work with is really related to trust and credibility. And when I'm looking at leaders that do really well, they know themselves really well. And what I mean by that is like they know themselves well and they're authentic in who they are. I think I struggle when I see a leader and I know them outside of their role, and I'm like, these two ain't lining up with me."
Right.
And I think that really causes some issues with trust and credibility with the people that they're leading. Um, so I think
Real quick
that's
question
that's a
on that.
really big one for me.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you
No, you're
see
good.
that a lot in like what one thing I noticed when I was in education that and I didn't even know the extent of it until I got out of education and started a team myself and that kind of thing. But do you see that discrepancy a lot in leadership and education? And the reason that I ask is because very few people get into education for the money, right? They get
Yeah,
into it because they want to give back and whatever. There's a specific personality type that kind of goes towards education. And a lot of times, I think sometimes they just say, well, what's the next step? And they become, they take on a leadership role, but they're not necessarily, that's not a natural position for them, right? I
totally.
don't know if this makes sense. So I'm just kind of
No,
curious if you see that a lot in education.
yeah, well, that's absolutely what happens. And I would even argue outside of education, like someone is really good at their job, right? Like you could be a really good real estate agent, and then someone's like, "Hey, you should lead a team," and you're like, "You know what? I totally should." And then like that's a different skill set. Like being a salesperson is a very different skill set than being a leader. In the same way that like being a principal is a very different skill set than being a math teacher. And I think Dan, the thing that you're talking about, like I was a really great high school math teacher. And so everyone was like, "Hey, you should be a like you should get into administration." And when I got in there, I was like, "Oh, I don't have like I need to do some like research and I need to like learn." And I think one of the huge misses and the thing that I'm pushing on districts all the time about is like you cannot throw people into a leadership role without the skills. Like they can know instruction all day, but like if they don't know how to like have a hard conversation with someone or to give feedback or to make a hard decision, like or how to manage your time block, like these are all things that we all know like make or break you as a leader. And so we have to intentionally teach them just as we would teach them like how to be a good math teacher. And so I absolutely think you're right, when we're, talking about people that just kind of get dumped into leadership roles.
Yeah.
So you bring up a good point, right? So Jocko Willink, I've been watching a lot of him, and one of the things that he said is anybody can be taught to be a leader. And I
Mhm.
truly do believe that. I think you can learn
Mhm.
any skill you want to. But he said something that I thought was really intriguing. He said that some leaders are gifted and born with certain skills than others.
Totally.
So when you're looking at like teachers, for example, that are looking to move from, let's say, being a math teacher to the administration, what
Mhm.
are some of the things that you're telling them, like, hey, we need to start training them on these things before they can even take the next step?
I love that. The one that sticks out the most for me, and I think this goes with what makes you a good teacher or what makes you a good leader, is emotional intelligence. So, like, do you have the ability to connect with people and build relationships? Because at the end of the day, when things are really hard, those connections and relationships are the foundation with which like you're going to solve problems on. And so for me, whenever I was like hiring leaders to help me or whatever, I am always looking for emotional people who have high emotional intelligence. I would rather that and have you less aware of content. Like I can teach you the content. I want you to like really get people because what comes with that and by getting people I also need you to get yourself, right? Like those I think go coincide. Um but what comes with that is like you listen really well. Like you're not just listening and to wait to talk, but like you're listening, you have empathy for people. You really get where other people are. And that's where you kind of like build a great team is when you have that high emotional intelligence. I would say the other thing, Scott, and I think this is learned, and this is really freaking hard for people. It's hard for me. Um, like twofold. One, it's having a growth mindset around who you are as a person and like being able to fail very publicly. Um, and then along with that is when you fail, you take ownership. And I love that you brought up Jocko Willink because like this idea of extreme ownership where like your team, like if you're leading a team and someone messes up, one, that you take ownership for that. Or if you mess up, that you take ownership for that. Because the quickest way to build trust and credibility with your team is taking ownership or taking responsibility for situations and having integrity with the things that you say you're going to do. I mean, those are like just two really basic components of leading people.
Well, and you know what I find so interesting about that is when we look at our leadership in politics, it is completely different, right? So you got people who are
Yeah.
fanatical. I
Yeah.
don't care if it's the
Yep.
right or the left.
Yep.
People are fanatical about whoever it is that they support.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is, when's the last time you heard one of those people say, my bad.
I know.
That one's on me. Okay. Like they never, ever, ever admit that they're wrong. And so
Totally.
what's the difference there? Is that manipulation versus leadership? Like, why are people fanatical for these people who can't even take ownership for themselves?
I have absolutely no idea. What I will say is when I've worked with leaders who really struggle with that, it's ego, right? And I when I go and do trainings with schools, and I'm talking to, superintendents or principals or teachers or what, it doesn't matter. I'm like, how many times, one, like it starts with us, right? How many times do kids ever hear us like own our mistakes, right? So as a leader, if I have employees or if I'm a teacher and I'm leading a classroom, like it is on me to model what I want the behavior to look like in my school. And so that starts with me as a leader. So like I want I want to create in my culture, whether it's, in or out of education, doesn't matter. I want to create on my team this idea that like it's okay to make mistakes and I'm going to own them because really when you fail, that's where all the learning happens. And so I want to create a culture of error where like, yeah, like we mess up, we're humans, but that's hard for people because it's very public. People have egos, and egos are great. Like, we need them. But it's also really important to model. And I think just on like a parent standpoint, I like when I'm not a perfect parent all the time. I mess up every day. And so like trying to make sure that I'm intentionally modeling for the kids, like, hey, I shouldn't have said that the way that I said that with you. And I just want to own that, like I kind of sucked today. And like, I just want to like let you know that like it's not okay what you did, but like I could have handled that better. And modeling for them that like it's okay to like make mistakes and we got to own them when they happen so we can learn from them is really, really vital to being, in my opinion, a great leader in your life.
Totally.
It's funny you say this. I got two scenarios that I just want to share real quick. So I coach my daughter's softball team, and we were working on rundowns. Okay, well, I taught rundowns the way that I learned years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a new age, right? There's things have evolved and it's been better and things like that. And one of the girls last Saturday was telling me like, "Hey, that's not right." I was like, "No, it is." And then us coaches collaborated again. So yesterday, I go up to her and I'm like, "Hey, Abby, this is the only time you're going to hear me say this come out of my mouth, okay? I was wrong. You were right." And it's so hard, but
It totally.
it really wasn't that hard because I'm like, you know what? Like, I want the whole team to know that I'm human as well. And I
Yeah.
do make mistakes because, like, my biggest thing on athletics specifically is be aggressive. I don't care if you make mistakes, just be aggressive.
Yep.
Um, but it also goes into our marriage of
Mm-hmm.
we're afraid to take ownership. Jocko Willick, extreme ownership, right?
Yeah.
It goes into us leading our team. It
Mm-hmm.
goes into, you mentioned it, the ego piece, right? Like, you're in mortgages just like I am. If a closing's missed, do you take ownership of it and
Mm-hmm.
say, hey, this is my fault. This is where we could have fixed it. Or is it, now my underwriter's an idiot,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like,
Yeah,
it's so
totally.
easy to deflect, or, hey, the client didn't get me the documentation. Like, I can't do anything. Sorry. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, there is some of that, but like, how do you make sure that you're showing the extreme ownership of like, hey, we're going to own this. We're going to put our ego to the side. I guess another example that I have for you, we've all had people work for us. When they leave, do you pull the thumb or point the finger that
Mm-hmm.
they left because they just didn't listen to me? Or is
Mm-hmm.
it I didn't lead them in the right way?
Yep.
So how do you handle that? What do you look at? Do you do like an after action report of like, what does that look like? And tell us a hard story of you admitting that you were wrong.
So
Oh
are you kind of
man.
are you kind of asking like what does she teach
Yes.
Mm.
people to do on how do you convince people, for lack of a better word, to take responsibility, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think well, a couple things. So, um, and I hope Andrew doesn't listen to this because I want him to know I'm never wrong when it comes to him and I, and so I'm not taking ownership for anything that goes wrong. But at anything
We'll block
else,
him.
yeah,
We'll
okay,
block him.
cool. Um, so two things that I think are really important when we are talking about how do I do that and how do I, because I'm also like a firm believer in systems. So we can, talk in the clouds all day long about like what we should do, but if you don't have a system to really intentionally like create that habit, it's going to be a problem. So two things that have worked for me, like really making sure that I am like developing those skills, is one, like learning. So I want to make sure that I have intentional time every single day in my calendar blocked out to work on a specific skill that I'm working on. So like if like my ego gets in the way, which it does sometimes, right? It does less now than it did 10 years ago. Then I'm going to be finding things to really like learn about to help me and build a replacement behavior around the issue that I'm having. So like one great book that I'm thinking of that I just love, I love, is by Ryan Holiday. Ego is the Enemy is a really great book. But I think like finding ways in your calendar time to like get a little bit better every day and like learn a new skill, that's a big piece. And then the other piece is making sure that we're reflecting. And for me, what I do is, I have it's like a weekly rhythm register that really I track like my habits and my behaviors and my goals and all that. But on Sunday, I'm always reflecting on like how I did on that on the week and like what went well, what didn't go well, what was a dumpster fire, and what adjustments I need to make to the next week. And I think finding some sort of like habit like that where you can check yourself before you go too far off the road, um, is is really really helpful. The other thing, Scott, that I think happens just by nature of putting yourself in positions where you have to own things, is this recognition as a leader that like the only control I have in my life is myself. Like I don't have my circle of control is so small compared to like what I think I control. And so a lot of times as leaders, we try to control people or we try to control situations or we try to control the weather or like whatever. I actually only have control over my response to all of those things and how I model for people what I want them to do. And so for me, as I'm like learning about how I want people to lead their teams or whatever, even when I'm training the way that I'm modeling what I want them to do. And so I think as humans, a lot of what we learn is by modeling. That's how kids learn everything. And so that's really a great way to teach folks some of those skills.
Keep talking about like leading yourself, and I love that concept. And I mean, this is leaders got to lead, right? And
Yeah.
Jen and I have talked about this, like the multitude of different leaders from the highest up of like Jesus and Hitler to like Donald Trump to Joe Biden to politicians, whatever it may be. But to simplify it, like so many people are like, well, I'm not a leader. Let's get into like leading yourself. Like
Yeah.
give us some of that. I really I want to pick your brain on that piece of it. And I have an idea of what I believe it is of holding myself accountable and following my calendar, following my time block, doing what I say I'm going to do, right? Having integrity. But give us some more insight on that.
Yeah.
And real quick, just to piggyback on that, do you find just because you're doing so much leadership within the schools and stuff like that, do you find that this specific thing is a sticking point for a lot of people in leadership roles, right? Because they think I got to lead all of them and they forget about themselves. Like, I'm just curious if you see that.
100%. I think that but again, it's like a lack of knowledge, right? So I think that, when you're in sales, you learn very quickly, like, oh shit, I have to like work harder on myself than I do on my job, right? Like we know that in order to be better in all of these different areas of your life, I think education, people are in constant reactive mode and like, it's like fight or flight on some level.
Mhm.
And there's a lack of understanding and time, frankly, for self-care. And so the thing that I absolutely try to drill with people is like, it does like, and it's not even being selfish. It's like you actually have to like feed and water yourself, like mentally, physically, emotionally. And tend to your energy and your emotions. Like you have to have a routine filled with good habits and create consistency in this like time of maybe inconsistency or stress that you're having in your life. And we don't do that, right? But like you have to build those habits. Like you can't just, you know, go on a walk once every couple weeks. Like it has to be a very intentional thing. So being like trying to be thoughtful about how we can build that in the days of like educators and principals and whatever. But absolutely, I think it's really important to talk about. And Scott, the one thing that and this is sort of connected to a story, I guess, but I think, about, I was a principal about 10 years ago. Um, and when I had just had my second child, and after he was a couple weeks old, I found out, and I had a 1-year-old also, so newborn and a 1-year-old, and I found out I had to have brain surgery. And I was supposed to be coming back from maternity leave to be a principal. And the reason I bring that story up is because that entire situation, I ended up having to have multiple surgeries across the country for a few years. And I'm good now. But I learned a lot through that experience. And I'm grateful for it in the sense I would never want to do it again, but I'm grateful in the sense that like I learned a lot about leading myself. And when you think about like all the things that you have to do to get through like life, it's really hard. Like it's not, and I think sometimes we don't talk about that necessarily. But like there's no way that I could have, led my staff through a situation like that. Or I ended up taking on that discipline and attendance job mid situation when I was having brain surgeries, or lead my family. Like I had to really make sure that I was leading myself. I was setting up as many habits as I could to like not lose my mind. That was a funny brain joke, by the way. And I think that that's I know, great. Um, I think it's really important. And so you see people who go through difficult situations, and sometimes they come out of it like kind of a worse person, right? And then some people come out and they're like, and you're like, oh my God, like they learned so much from that. I think it really boils down to like leading yourself. And the thing that I learned from that experience is like, no one's coming to save me. Like Andrew and I had to figure this out on our own. Um, and it really started with me. And so, as you think about like leading other people, like you have to take accountability and ownership for like who you are as a person and what are those things that you are doing to like get better so that you're better for your job.
Totally.
So
Yeah. And
can,
I think back to like, it sounds to me after hearing that story, like that was a moment in your life where it forced your hand in a certain respect.
Hmm.
You had to lead yourself or you had to quit. Like there was
Yeah.
kind of no in between, right?
Yeah.
And I guess where I'm getting is like a two-part question. Number one is that kind of a shifting moment in your life where this aspect of self, because you've talked about self leadership over and over and over again. It seems like that's kind of like a pinnacle item for you in terms of leadership is starts with you first, right?
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
I kind of think back to my journey when I left education and realized I didn't know jack about leadership, and I'm trying to like lead crews when I'm doing flips and stuff like that. And I totally clueless. Then I started learning about it and realized, oh my gosh, I would have been such a better coach had I known all this stuff, right? So anyway, but then I kind of turned a corner at some point, and it was just like, this is really more about me than it is everybody else. And it came
Yeah.
from trial by fire. And I won't
Hmm.
go into, all of those stories for myself, but I can relate to what you're talking about. Very different scenario, but I can relate to what you're talking about. So my first part is, was that the turning point for you? Or did you have a big turning point where that became so important to you? And the second part of that is, this is something that's really important to you. What do you find when you're trying to teach these other leaders about this stuff? What do you find is the biggest sticking point where they just fight you on it?
Hmm.
And or
Yeah.
they just have a really hard time getting it, right? Because this is the thing that you get.
Yeah.
You've got this one. So you probably do a pretty good job of helping people understand that. But I'm just curious where you see that sticking point. Hey guys, Dan Gomer here with the Leaders Gotta Lead podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully you are enjoying the content, and if you are, I've got great news because there's more where that came from. Just click on the link in the show notes to discover new ways to plug into what we're doing, to find new content that we're putting out, and to discover how we might be able to work together to elevate your leadership game. Just click on the link in the show notes and let's take our leadership success to the next level.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, yes. I feel like, back in like 2012, 2013, I really kind of started getting into personal development, 2014, I would say. And then it was sort of funny because it was like, 2016 is when this all hit the fan. And it was like, well, like here's where all of the things that you learn, like you're you gotta do them, right? And so absolutely that's what happened. And I felt like, really for 3 years, 4 years, and 1 year, I was like basically bedbound. I mean, Andrew and I it was like we had to like very openly like talk about the things that we had learned because we were leading our little baby kids through this, or like our larger, extended family that was helping us out. And so it was a turning point for me, and it was and I'm grateful for this lesson of like, you're gonna die. Like everyone's gonna die. We just don't ever talk about it. But I think that for me, understanding that very clearly now, like allowed me to get very clear on my values. And so, you know, moving forward, I just feel grateful, that like, I'm grateful to like know that like I'm gonna die because I make different decisions because of that. Like I have less fear. And so, to your second question, Dan, of like, where's the sticking point for people? I think there's a couple of things. One, I always see I always see a struggle with like just like a lack of information. So like people in leadership roles might not take time out of their day to like learn about how to be a better leader. I also think that they don't wait long enough to see how things improve. So like a lot of times we do this, especially in schools, is we'll try something and it doesn't work
Yeah.
17 seconds later. And so we like throw it
Yep.
out, right? And so what you have to know is like those little things that you implement to be a better leader or lead yourself in a better way, like those take years. I mean, you guys know, like those habits that you add, like it takes a long time to see results from that. And so I think that we struggle with like that delayed gratification. And then the last thing that I see as a biggest struggle is really that like taking ownership. And that's where you have to do a lot of work around like your ego. And I think a lot of that, you guys, is tied to fear. Like I was saying, like I think so many of us are scared to suck or scared to be wrong. And that's why I'm so grateful for that lesson that I learned when I was sick. Cause like at the end of the like my life, I don't care if someone talked crap about like a stupid post I had, or like I stood up like a couple months ago, I stood up in a training and like had my fly down the whole time. And I'm like, oh well. Like I don't have that same feeling that probably a lot of other people do because like I learned such a valuable lesson. And so I think like as much as leaders can just like do and like feel that failure, like like you're not going to die from failing, but like a lot of people feel like they will. And so I
And
think that that's a big sticking point too.
what's so funny about that, because I feel exactly what you're talking about, right? Like I used to have the perfectionist
Hmm.
complex,
Sure.
which you would have told my middle school teachers that they'd be like,
Huh?
I got it. Um, but yeah, and when I finally said I don't have to be perfect, like it
Hmm.
really doesn't matter. In fact, I would rather be openly flawed than perfect. There's this fear that blocked me from doing that. And when I
Yeah.
finally released it, it's like 1,000 pounds was lifted off my shoulders because I don't have to hold up this impossible freaking goal anymore. It's irrelevant. In fact, it's more powerful that I'm authentic, like you talked about earlier,
Totally.
and
Yes.
am willing to admit that I screwed up and that I'm flawed, because then I can't screw it up. Because if I do, I just go, that was bad. I'll fix it. Won't do it again.
Yeah.
So I don't
Well,
have to worry about it.
that's the miss. Like, and I want to say this to people, like, by the way, if you're a leader, no, your team doesn't want you to be perfect. Like, imagine how weird that is, right? Like, you, I want a leader that's like, oh, like I messed that up. Like, they want you to be a human being, and part of being a human is messing up. And I think there's just this like miss with people, or it's like you have this idea that you have to be like on your game all the time. Like, then they can't connect to you. And so it's really important that we model that behavior as a leader.
I love that. And I wrote down some notes here. So I just want to make sure because I really want people to understand that they're not just only leading other people, but they need to lead, they need to start by leading themselves. And
Yeah.
I think that's a lot of what you teach. So first one is have clear values.
Yes.
Second one is have a growth mindset and grow your knowledge. Third one
Yep.
is be patient when you implement.
Hmm.
Fourth one is take ownership. And
Hmm.
number five is be okay with failure.
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
anything else that you would add to that or put them in a different order?
No, I mean, I think those are all great. I mean, the biggest one is like know your values. Like you have to know because as a leader, like every decision you make, you have to anchor them in your values. Even when like the storm is coming and the wind is blowing and like you have to be like, no, like this is what I deeply believe and like and that anchors you, right? When things are really really hard, you can kind of like anchor yourself in your values. And that's Brene Brown has a really great list of values. Like if you Google Brene Brown list of values, it has a great exercise that you can do to like really hone into like what those are. So like if you lead a team, I would encourage you to do that. I would also encourage you to do that like with your team. So like they do that because one of the things that like we know as a team is like people have different values. And so it's important for you all to know what each other's values are because like if I really value something and like you don't value it, like that might be a conflict. And so we have to make sure that we are being mindful of that with like team dynamics.
Hey,
I
Jen,
love it.
do you have if you have a link for that, will you
I'll
uh,
send it to you.
email
Yeah.
that over to me and then
Yep.
we'll put it in the description or whatever for
Yeah.
the yeah.
Yeah, totally. I will for sure do that.
So I want to pick your brain on something real quick. That was a brain joke as well.
I was
Um,
waiting for that, Scott.
the implementation piece, being patient with it.
Yeah.
Um, I know for me that means something totally different than it might mean for both you and Dan.
Hmm.
So I feel like if I'm in sales, for example, if I'm going to implement something, I want to see it out for at least a quarter. I want to see
Hmm.
it for a full quarter. There's other times where it needs to take 6, 12, maybe even 24 months. How do you decipher between that as a leader, and how do you get your team to buy into that as well?
I just like I try to provide examples, like real life examples, and frankly, like when I'm training, like examples from my own life. So like I talk about New Year's resolutions all the time. Like how many of us messed up on New Year's resolutions? Or I talk about like our own behaviors, like how many times do we mess up when we're implementing something? A lot of times in education, a sticking point is like student behavior, right? Like they'll get fired up about a student who's misbehaving. And so I'll remind them, like, hey, let's think back to the last time you told yourself you were going to go on a run and like you didn't go, right? So I've heard in research a couple of when we're talking about like behavior modifications, a couple different timelines. One of them is like a minimum of 3 weeks to like adjust to a new habit. The latest one that I heard though from research, which I think is really fascinating as we're thinking about like changing habits, is 1 month for every year that you've been doing something. So you can imagine that, like, if you have had a particular habit, um, or someone on your team that you're leading has had a particular habit, it's going to take them a long freaking time to adjust. And as leaders, we struggle with that because we want, like, if we see a behavior that we don't like, we want it to change immediately. And, like, it's not going to. And so I remind leaders, like, hey, we all have things that, like, aren't great. We're patient with ourselves. We are less patient with other people changing their behaviors. And so we need to give them the grace that we frankly give ourselves sometimes when we are making changes to habits or behaviors.
And there's a balance in there too, right?
Yep.
And there's a balance between accountability
Oh, yes.
and like leeway, you know.
So so when I tell leaders, and again, this is the same for teachers or parents, the way you lead is um you have to do things with people. So you can't just hold them to a high level of expectation and give them no support. So if you are being the best leader that you can, you have high expectations and then you have the support that matches that level of expectation. So you can't just have high, whatever, like you hold them accountable in the same way that like as a parent, I have high expectations for my kids, but like if they mess up, I don't just like I'm not their friend, right? I'm not, as a leader, I'm not their friend. I don't just give them support. I make sure that like they're accountable for their actions. But regardless of that, I'm going to tell them I love you and I care about you. And because I love you and I care about you, I'm going to help support you through this like taking ownership. So like I'm going to put supports in place, but like that doesn't erase the accountability piece, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I love that. And it's funny because when you were talking about the 1 month for every year,
Hmm.
I'm thinking of teaching an old dog new tricks. And I think that
Yep.
saying is bullshit in
Hmm.
all reality. You just have to be more patient with the time
Totally.
it's going to take for them to learn.
Yes.
So yes, the
Yes.
older somebody is, or the longer that they've been doing that bad habit, it's going to take longer, much longer, right?
Totally.
They've been doing it for 20 years. That's 20 months. That's almost 2 years.
Yep.
So
And
like that's a long time when you really start thinking of math.
Yep.
you know
Yeah.
who's so good at talking about that is Joe Dispenza.
Oh,
Like
yes.
the
Hmm.
neuroplasticity
Yep.
and all of that kind of stuff. And I have found going through his work, just another resource for people. Look up Joe Dispenza. But he's got tons of free content. But our ability, I would even argue that if there's a strong will to make that adjustment, it's actually really quick. Like once
Yeah.
we set our
Agreed.
mind, like when I'm like, that's it. I'm not
Hmm.
smoking anymore. And we are
Hmm.
just like, I'm not doing it.
Yep.
It's done. Right. And our
Agreed.
brain begins to start before it like really maybe forms that new habit. Maybe it takes an extended period of time, right? Because you've got to get those synapses firing together and all that kind of stuff. And it takes time. But at the same time, the biggest changes that I have made in my life have been instantaneous.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that anymore, or I'm going to do that, you know?
That's because your values were clear.
Exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
and I think it goes back to also being okay with failure because
Hmm.
you talk about stopping smoking, right? Next thing you know, you take a drag at a bar one night, whatever it may be, right? Like, okay, I messed up. I'm not going to do that anymore, right? But going back
Hmm.
to being clear with your values, but also being patient with the implementation that you had and being okay with failure.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, there's a lot that we can go
Yeah.
deeper on this. I mean, for me, I think it's so interesting because there's so many people that say that I'm not a leader, I'm not a leader, I'm not a leader. And it's like, well, yes, you are. And
Yeah, you are.
Jen and I've talked about it, like you're leading something or someone. You're
Yeah.
leading your family, your kids, your spouses, whatever it may be.
Friends, your community.
Spouse, let's say spouse, not spouses. Um, right. So like your friends, community, everything else.
Yep.
So, but I think you hit the nail on the head. You got to start with yourself. If you can't lead
Yeah.
yourself, if you can't hold yourself accountable and be okay to look in the mirror and just say, you know what, I suck today,
Yeah.
but I'm going to fix that tomorrow.
Yep.
Like, and having those clear values, I think that's something huge. And I'm glad that you shared a lot of that. And I hate to hear that it happened from having brain surgery, right? Like having to kind of learn that as quick as you probably had to at that time. So, but I'm glad that you learned it. So I
Well,
appreciate you sharing the story with us.
yeah, definitely. And here's the cool thing about that. I always think about this, right? The near-death experience, life-changing moment, you know? So many people, and I'm not saying this was you, Jen, but so many people, that's what has to happen for them to change.
Yeah.
They have to get in that car accident. They have to have the loved one die.
Hmm.
Like there is just no way they are going to change unless something dramatic happens in their life. And the way I look at it is if we pretend that that has already happened or put ourselves into that position in our mind
Hmm.
or um, you know, like what I always say to myself is I never want that to be the thing that changes my life and my
Yeah.
perspective. How can I change my perspective now? We have the power to make these massive changes in our life if we listen to people like Jen who's sharing a story of like, hey, this thing happened to me and it completely changed my life, completely changed how I lead. Now, you have a whole new perspective on life and how you're showing up and how you're impacting the world. We can learn from that. We can be in your shoes by trying to put ourselves in your shoes and apply it to our own life. And so by watching this podcast here today, hopefully this is an opportunity for whoever's watching it to to do that, and to be able to grow through someone else's experiences so you don't have to go through it, but you can still gain all the value from
That's my hope.
it. Yeah.
Well, and you bring up a good point, right? Like some of the most wealthy people that are out there had to hit rock bottom with bankruptcy,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
Like some of the people that are the healthiest had to hit rock bottom by being on an operating table and seeing the bright light. Like you look at all of this, and I think it's one of those things like you like make the change, like just hold yourself accountable, lead yourself. If you don't want to lead anybody else, lead yourself. I think that's the most important thing that we can take away from today for sure.
Yeah.
That is a great ending statement, Scott.
Well, and I was going to say we'll wrap things up here, but Jen, do you have a couple things? Number one, how can people get in touch with you? What's the easiest way for them to talk to you? And do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with everyone?
Well, you could find me on Instagram. It's just Jen_Gallegos. And I would say like the biggest thing, honestly, you guys, is like just like go live. I don't know, like focus, lead yourself, go live, try new things, mess it up, try again, take care of yourself, right? Like all those things that like really go into leading yourself. You got one life and you got to go live it. So
Love it. Screw it up as fast as you
mess
can.
it up. Yep, totally. Mess it up,
The
man.
faster you fail, the faster you can fix it, right?
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
right. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jen. And we'll wrap up with this. Scott and I started this whole thing because we want to connect with leaders like you, Jen, and all of the other leaders that are out there and just have more conversations like this. So if this is resonating with you, we would love to connect with you, whether it's to be a guest on the show, partnership within business, or whatever it is. We want to connect with you. If any of these podcasts are resonating with you, reach out. We'd love to connect with you. Jen, thanks so much for being here today. This was great.
Thanks for having
Jen.
me, you too.
We may have to have you on again because I feel like we could go quite a
We
bit
could talk
deeper
for a
with
while.
I think we
Yeah.
just got the surface with Jim. I think there's so much more to that depth. I think that ocean is pretty deep. So
Yeah, definitely. So thank you, Jen. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jen.